Have you ever heard of a creature, over 8 feet tall, fighting off a 600-pound alligator? Not to kill, but to protect its injured child. This isn't fiction. It happened deep in the Okefenokee Swamp, and 4 people saw it with their own eyes. Contrary to every legend, Bigfoot isn't a predator. He's a father. When his child stepped on broken glass and was dying from infection, he didn't lash out. He waited. And when a 62-year-old widow walked out with nothing but a piece of cloth and a jar of honey, he let her help. A young researcher, a pragmatic biologist, a kind old vet, and Martha. They didn't just witness a creature. They witnessed trust. In this video, you'll see a heart-pounding battle between Bigfoot and a monstrous gator. The moment Bigfoot allowed humans to touch his wounded child, and an ending that left everyone in tears. That baby was saved inside a wooden cabin, with Martha singing softly, and the creature holding out its hand like a child asking for comfort. 3 days later, 2 sets of footprints, one big, one now steady, walked back into the wild. And on Martha's porch, a silent message made of reeds. Keep going. If you still think Bigfoot is just a myth, watch this, before it disappears. The mud was soft this time of year, dark and spongy under the half-rotted boards of the old walkway that led to the edge of the briar patch. Just before the light fully sank, when the frogs and whip-poor-wills started their calls like old songs rehearsed each evening, Martha Briar knelt beside the splintered steps of her porch and squinted. The air smelled thick of tannin and honey. Cypress shadows stretched long across the water's rim. That was when she noticed the first print. It sank deeper than her boot ever had. 5 toes, wide ball, no shoe. The heel curved like a crescent dipped in swamp. And beside it, smaller, off-kilter, shallow on one side like someone limping. The small print leaned out, as if trying to escape its own pain. Martha didn't say a word. Her gaze lifted, slow, to the narrow game trail just past the bee boxes. Something had come through here, and it hadn't come easy. The sim tree near the trail bent slightly from last night's storm, and from one of its lower branches hung a single strand of hair, dark, coarse, and matted with moisture. It twisted in the breeze, catching the last rays of dusk like a thread dipped in rust. Martha reached up, not to grab it, but to steady the branch. Her fingers paused halfway, hesitating. She stared at the hair, the mud, the staggered prints. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she reached across her left wrist with her right hand, touching the old scar hidden beneath her flannel sleeve. A faded line, like lightning over skin, from that saw accident 30 years back. She always did that when something felt wounded, out in the reeds. A ripple pulled wide and then vanished like breath into water. A few dragonflies spun toward the light, hovering above the pond's edge before darting away. Frogs croaked low, but not constant, like they were waiting for a cue. Behind her, the cabin light flickered. Not electric, just oil. Amber glow bouncing off cracked window panes and worn shelves lined with mason jars and old fishing reels. No radio, no fan, no hum of the modern world. Martha lived the way time forgot, on purpose. No one had forced her to choose this silence. It was the quiet she needed since Lewis died. Since her boy never came back from that war he wasn't old enough for. She didn't talk about him anymore, but everything around her still did. The rocking chair that creaked without a body. The yellowed letters tucked in a tin box. The sweater she never wore but never folded away. She rose slow from her crouch, her knees cracking like old branches. Her hand brushed the hem of her skirt, not to clean it, just to feel the fabric again. That skirt was older than most things now, frayed at the seams, patched with love, made when her hands were sure. She stepped off the porch, counted 20 barefoot strides in the dirt toward the hives. The bees didn't stir. The smell of honey was heavy tonight, heavier than it should have been. She remembered something her father once said when he was laying fence wire before the floods came through. Always watch what the honey draws. Some things sweeter than sugar. Some things just hiding the sting. A breeze rolled in from the south, lifting her hair and carrying the sound of wings from the water's edge. She stopped at the bee boxes. One had been moved, shifted slightly from its square print in the ground. Not knocked over, not raided, just moved. As if someone curious had looked and then set it gently back down, not understanding the purpose but respecting the place. Her eyes followed the trail past it, into the darkening trees, where the air turned thicker and the ground held secrets longer. She didn't light her lantern. Not tonight. She knew better than to call attention. Instead, she walked back to the porch, took the tin cup from the rail, and filled it from the pitcher by the door. The water tasted faintly of metal, like the old pipes buried under the mossy soil. She sipped slow, eyes still fixed on the spot near the reeds where that ripple had been. The surface was calm again, but not still. It never really was. She sat on the top step, her boots untied, toes resting on the warm plank. Her fingers curled around the cup, but her gaze never left the tree line. It was in these hours, the liminal space between light and full dark, when the swamp revealed itself most honestly, not in the loud noises or the sharp rustles, but in the absences. The birds that didn't return to roost, the sudden hush in a frog's throat, the way even the insects paused their rhythm, like they were waiting on permission. Martha didn't believe in monsters. She believed in survival. She believed in weather. In instinct, in the idea that everything, no matter how strange, was just trying to find a safe place to lie down for the night. Still, her heart beat different now. Not fear, not quite. Just something like the memory of fear, softened by years and soaked in sympathy. She looked down at the ground again. The prints were fading with the dew, but she'd already seen enough. One large, one small, one hurt. Inside the cabin, the beeswax candle by the window had burned low. Its flame bent toward the glass as if drawn to something outside. Martha stood again, slower this time, and went inside. She didn't lock the door. Never had. What good was a lock out here? If something wanted in, it was already close enough to knock. Instead, she pulled the heavy curtain closed and set the cup down on the wooden table scarred by years of use. She reached into the drawer, pulled out a folded scrap of brown paper, and opened it flat on the table. Inside, a pressed flower, brittle now, pink-hued with a soft fuzz on its stem. Next to it, a pencil stub and a name. Just a name. She didn't trace the letters. Just looked at them, then folded the paper again and put it back. Outside, the frogs had gone quiet. In their place, a different sound. Wet, low. Not a growl. More like a long breath, exhaled near the water's edge. Then, silence. She returned to the porch. The night was cooler now. The wind had shifted. Out past the hives, past the cane grass. Something moved. Just once, just enough. The reeds trembled. A heavy step, then another. But no scream, no roar, no eyes glinting from the dark. Just the weight of something that didn't belong, moving like it always had. Before people decided where wild things should go, Martha didn't step forward. She didn't call out. Instead, she knelt. Same as she had years ago beside her son's bed when the news came. Same as she had when the barn caught fire and she had to choose which animals to save. She knelt, slow and steady, her hand resting on her knee, her other over her scar again. She whispered to the wind, not a prayer, not a plea, just a breath. I see you. The wind answered in reeds, and then nothing. Somewhere in the swamp, something licked its wound and watched, and the bees kept humming, never once stopping their work. And Martha Breyer, widow, mother, keeper of bees, leaned back against her step and waited for morning. Not in fear, in witness, because sometimes something passes through the land not to haunt it, but to remember it, and she would be here. watching, remembering too. The prints would be gone by sunrise, the sim tree would dry, but the strand of hair would remain, curled around bark like a question she was not yet meant to answer. And in the soil beneath her nails, in the flicker of her lamp, in the sting of a memory she did not speak aloud, something had shifted, something had come close. But it hadn't taken, it had looked, it had limped, it had passed, and she had seen it. And that was enough for tonight. But not the end, not yet. The light shifted slow and golden across the slats of the narrow skiff as Caleb Harlan reached for his notebook, brushing the sweat off his neck with a flick of his sleeve. The swamp around them was quieter than it should have been for late spring. Cicadas buzzed now and again, but even that seemed more cautious than usual. He squinted at the shoreline ahead, where reeds bent low like they'd seen something pass. He wanted to believe he could feel it too, some current just beneath the air, like the tension before a thunderclap. He was young enough to trust that kind of feeling. Young enough to think it might mean something if you looked hard enough. Daniel Pike didn't look up. He was busy tightening the tripwire between two bent cypress roots, checking the tension by pulling it with one gloved finger. No batteries, no beeping gadgets. Just a spring, a little bell, and the smell of metal warmed by sun. Daniel didn't believe in feelings. He believed in mechanics, in friction and prints and weight displacement. Everything had a measurable consequence, and he wrote them all down in neat columns that nobody else read. The third man in the boat didn't do much of anything. He just sat there, legs crossed, hands folded over a leather satchel that had seen more years than both boys combined. Dr. Amos Hargrove blinked slowly behind his thick-rimmed glasses, watching the tree line. He carried no gun, no fear, and not even an opinion unless someone asked him for it. His tools were old: blunt scissors, glass dropper, iodine bottle with a faded label, all tucked in cloth pouches like the ones used back when folks still sewed their own wounds. He hadn't been a practicing vet in over 20 years, but there were things he hadn't forgotten. Things the young ones never bothered learning in the first place. The boat nudged softly into the bank. Daniel stood, brushing his hands, and slung his camera over his shoulder. Not digital, old film. He didn't trust anything that could be erased with a keystroke. He reached back and handed Caleb a plaster mold kit, tapping it twice to remind him not to spill it like last time. Caleb grabbed it and rolled his eyes without letting Daniel see. The trees here grew so thick they blurred the light. Everything green seemed darker. The ground held water just beneath the moss, and the heat pressed down from all sides. The air smelled like rotting bark and something else, something sweet and too warm. Like honey left too long in the sun, Daniel was the first to spot her. She stood just past the path, near a spot where the bank gave way to a sliver of dry sand. Her boots were muddy but upright. Her skirt caught the breeze like it still remembered how to dance. Martha Breyer didn't look surprised to see them. If anything, she looked like she'd been expecting someone, just not quite them. "Morning," she said, voice low, hands resting empty by her sides. The wind lifted a strand of silver hair from her temple. Dr. Hargrove nodded first, stepping down into the sand, moving like someone who knew his bones too well. "Ms. Breyer," he said softly, like he already knew her name, though none of them had ever come this far before. Caleb stood silent, watching her eyes. They didn't wander, didn't flick to the camera or the satchel or the plaster kit. She looked at people like she was weighing more than words. Daniel got straight to it. "We've been tracking some unusual movement west of here. Saw prints in the silt yesterday. Heavy set, barefoot, looks bipedal, might be." "You saw the little one too?" she asked, cutting through his sentence like a twig snapped underfoot. Caleb blinked. "What do you mean, little one?" She didn't answer. She turned toward the tree line and began walking. No invitation, no explanation. Just slow steps into the shadow, expecting they'd follow. And they did. The trail she led them on didn't exist on any map, but it was there all the same. Carved not by feet, but by memory. She moved with purpose but no urgency, like the swamp itself made space for her to pass. The further in they went, the less noise there was. Even Daniel stopped talking. They reached a bend where the ground leveled out, and the cypress knees rose like ancient bones from the mud. Dr. Hargrove paused, bent low, and pointed at a print barely clinging to the edge of a puddle. Caleb knelt beside it, careful not to smudge the rim, and looked close. The big one was familiar now. Deep, clean pressure on the ball and heel. Wide spread of toes, but next to it, half faded and leaning outward, was something smaller, almost fragile. The outer edge of the foot bore all the weight, the arch raised to avoid pressure. Infection, maybe, the doctor said. Not touching it, just observing. Could be they're walking on the side to avoid pain. Martha didn't say a word. She stared into the trees. Daniel clicked a photo. Just one. He adjusted his lens and snapped again, then turned to her. You seem to know this place well. I read the water, she replied. The ground writes more truth than most folks care to see. Caleb looked down the path, where the reeds swayed despite the stillness in the air. The scent of honey was stronger now, curling in from somewhere they couldn't quite see. He rubbed the back of his neck. The hair there stood up. Dr. Hargrove stepped away, crouching again near a broken cat tail. He brushed the mud with a stick. Something had passed through here, wide and low, dragging along the edge like it had been crouched. You're not out here for sport, Martha finally said, not turning. That's good, but if you're here to collect, you'll ruin it. Daniel frowned. We're here to document. No traps, no tranquilizers. You think the thing knows the difference? The silence that followed was tight. A sharp splash broke it, behind them, near the bend they'd come from. Caleb spun fast, nearly dropping the mold box. Nothing on the surface. Just a few circles of water expanding outward, like something had dipped under. Dr. Hargrove straightened slowly. Gators. Could be, Martha said. But gators don't test the line like that. They strike. What we just heard, that was hesitation. Daniel moved forward a step. We should set the tripwire up here. Natural bottleneck. Something's coming through regularly. I wouldn't, Martha replied, her voice flat. Not if you want it to keep coming. He stopped, uncertain, then looked to Hargrove. The old man didn't say a thing, just watched the trees again, listening. Martha walked to a cluster of reeds and knelt. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metal tin, unscrewed the top. The scent of beeswax and pine sap lifted from it, faint but present. She left it at the base of a stump without a word. Caleb tilted his head. Why, honey? Because sweetness is harder to ignore than fear. Daniel scoffed under his breath. But he didn't say more. The camera hung loose now against his side. He looked down at the wire in his hand and slowly began coiling it again. Martha straightened, brushed her palms on her skirt, and stepped back. I don't need you to believe me, she said. But whatever's out here, it remembers. Dr. Hargrove looked at her, long and deliberate. Then he nodded once, like an old promise had just been made. The wind picked up again, this time cooler, like it had come from deeper within the trees. It carried the smell of water and something faintly metallic, blood, maybe. Or rust. Caleb shivered, even though it wasn't cold. They started back without speaking. The reeds behind them bent again, slow and steady, though no one passed through. Later that night, Caleb would dream of a single footprint pressed in wet sand beside a jar of honey turned on its side. He wouldn't remember the rest, only that something looked back at him from behind the reeds, not with menace, but with caution. Like it, too, had questions it didn't dare ask, and the swamp would keep its answers, for now. The sun came down like a hammer that afternoon, heavy and merciless. The sky over Okefenokee had turned the color of bleached bone, and the heat shimmered across the narrow strip of sand where the trap had been set. Not a real trap. Not the kind meant to harm. More like a cage built from guilt and second chances. Caleb wiped sweat from his brow and stared at the wooden frame they'd rigged. half fishing net, half welded mesh, tied to cypress roots and anchored with old hunting wire. It leaned just enough to look harmless, the way you might prop open a screen door for a stray cat. Martha had added something to it that morning without telling them. A small glass jar, honey thick and golden, set right near the opening, beside a sliver of raw venison. She said nothing as she placed it, only looked at the jar and whispered something to herself before stepping back into the shade. Caleb watched her do it, didn't interrupt. Something about the way she handled the jar made it feel like more than bait, more like a promise. He didn't understand it, but he respected it. Daniel didn't say a word either. He'd argued earlier, said they should just use meat, blood if they had to. Predators follow scent, not sweetness. But Martha insisted. She said the scent of honey carried further than pain, and pain was all the world offered lately. The spot they picked sat just beyond the sand rise, where the reeds grew sparse enough to see but thick enough to hide behind. On the far side, water lapped gently against cypress knees, swollen with the season's flood. It was flat land, exposed, the kind of place predators watched for weak things that wandered too close to the edge. The trap had to be there, because everything about it said vulnerable, exposed, alone. Caleb hated how well it worked. Dr. Hargrove crouched nearby, double-checking the wire's release latch, his fingers moving with slow certainty. His hands didn't shake, not like the other two. The heat didn't seem to touch him. He'd done this kind of thing before, probably for animals no one bothered naming. But there was something quieter in him today, like he knew they were playing with rules older than theirs. They took their positions. Caleb in the blind behind the palmettos, Daniel under a camouflaged tarp about 10 feet west, camera loaded with film, lens dusted and ready. Martha sat back from it all, near the tree line, on an old driftwood log that looked like it belonged to another century. She didn't watch the trap. She watched the water. Time passed like sweat. Bees floated lazy around the wildflowers, then vanished. Even the birds held their calls. Then something shifted. Not a sound, a feeling. The reeds to the north swayed once. A pause. Then again, Caleb held his breath. Through the shimmer of heat, the form emerged. Smaller than he expected, but not weak, not at all. It limped, favoring one side, its gait uneven and hesitant, like every step was a question. It didn't look around. It didn't need to. It sniffed the air like it could read the whole story of what they'd done in the particles of scent and soil. The young one stepped into the clearing. Fur clung to its ribs, patchy with summer shedding. One leg dragged slightly, swollen at the ankle, raw where the skin had cracked. The belly hung shallow, drawn in. Not starvation, but close. It looked at the trap, then at the jar. Took another step. The heat danced around its outline, making it ripple like a ghost. But it was real. The way its shadow moved proved it. Martha didn't move. She didn't even blink. The young one paused at the mouth of the trap, its head tilted. Then it reached out, not like a child reaching for candy, more like a survivor testing the last safe place on Earth. It sniffed the honey, and for a moment, it looked like it might turn back. Then the water split. It didn't crash or explode. Not yet. Just a line, a sudden ripple, rushing in from the left. The reed split like breath before a scream. Old Scar had come. Caleb knew the gator by reputation, but even from where he crouched, he could see the jagged edge of that scarred jaw slicing through the water, fast and silent, eyes sunk low and fixed on the creature in the trap. Daniel cursed under his breath and shifted. Martha's hand went up, firm and flat. "Don't move." But Daniel didn't see. He rose, just enough to raise his voice, just enough to startle. Hey, move!" The young one jerked, startled. It turned half back, body tight, limping away from the opening. Not fast, not enough. Caleb's heart hit his ribs like a drum. Martha's hand stayed up. Her face never changed. Her eyes didn't blink. Her body was a statue carved by grief and fire and years of learning when not to act. The water exploded. Old Scar breached like something pulled from the underworld. Jaws wide, body launching from water to sand with a power no living thing had earned. His tail slammed down behind him, carving a crater of mud and shattered reeds. The young one shrieked, a sharp, choked sound of panic, and stumbled back toward the trap. Not for safety, just away. Caleb raised his arm, ready to shout, to throw, to do anything, but it didn't matter. Because that's when the giant came. From the far tree line, where the sun had already begun to fall behind the canopy, a shape moved. Not running, not charging, but fast, silent. It covered the distance in strides that bent logic. 7 feet tall at least. Shoulders like the hull of a boat. Fur slick with moisture. Chest rising, falling, not panting, controlled. It didn't roar. It didn't bare teeth. It moved like a protector who'd already counted the cost. Old Scar swung his tail again, sand flying. The giant didn't flinch. It stepped wide, grabbed a clump of reed, and flung it, sand and grit and stalks, right into the gator's eyes. Old Scar turned, snapping, but too late. The giant circled, quick, calculated, not attacking, herding. Caleb watched, eyes wide, breath held, heart beating too loud in his own ears. Daniel had dropped to a crouch, camera in hand, lens lowered now, just watching. The young one was in the trap again, not caught, just crouched, chest heaving. It didn't cry. It didn't move. Old Scar turned back, now clearly agitated. The giant stepped close, bare feet sinking deep into wet sand. Then, with no warning, it lunged, not reckless, but with a kind of grace no one expected. It swung its long arm low and hooked just under the gator's jaw, pulling toward the soft side, toward the eye. Old Scar twisted, rolled. Tail whipped, but missed. The two shapes collided in a blur of fur and scale and mud. Then a crack, then stillness. No blood, no victory. The gator slid back, retreating, one eye dark with grit and fury. The giant stood still, watching, waiting. Then, with a final look, Old Scar slid into the water and vanished, leaving only bubbles behind. The giant turned, not to Martha, not to the men, but to the young one, still crouched in the trap, staring up with eyes too big for its head. And then it did something no one could explain. It placed its massive body between the trap and the wind, shielding the younger one from the breeze. It stood like a wall, chest rising slow. Not a gesture of dominance, a gesture of care. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then harder, painting the sand in dark spots. Thunder echoed somewhere behind the horizon. Martha stood now, walking toward them. Not fast, not scared, like someone who had waited years for this moment and didn't want to startle it. The giant turned its head slightly, enough to see her, enough to understand. Then, in one motion, it bent low and extended a hand toward the young one, but didn't touch, and then it waited. The rain kept falling, and no one moved. Not yet. The wind changed before the rain did. It swept in low and sudden, curling through the cypress knees like a warning whispered in a language the body knew even if the mind didn't. The young one stayed huddled inside the trap, breath shallow, back against the mesh frame. The giant, bigger than any man had a right to be, stood between it and the direction Old Scar had vanished, motionless except for the subtle rise and fall of its ribs. Shoulders heaved once, then again. Each breath seemed to test the air for whatever might come back through it. The silence between the reeds didn't last long. Something stirred beneath it. The ripple returned, longer now, deeper, bending the surface like a muscle flexing just under skin. The water that had seemed still a moment before cracked open in a sudden spray. Old Scar didn't just return. He detonated from the water with the force of something ancient, something starved and angry and too proud to retreat. The beast drove forward on his belly, jaws wide, tail snapping left, then right. The giant reacted faster than anything that size should have been able to. It didn't jump, didn't panic. It stepped wide and braced, knees bent, arms loose at its sides. Old Scar's snout came low, aiming for the smaller figure still trapped. Caleb shouted. His voice was buried in thunder. Martha didn't move. Her eyes were wide, her fingers pressed into the bark of the tree beside her, but she didn't look away. The rain fell harder now. Each drop hissed against the hot sand, tiny bursts of steam rising like spirits leaving. The giant didn't use fists. It fought with weight, angles, terrain. When the gator struck first, jaws snapping like a vice, the giant shifted just enough for the blow to glance off the hip. The tail whipped around next, sweeping mud and reed, and this time it caught the side of the giant's leg, forcing a stumble. But it didn't fall. It pivoted, low and fast, and struck the gator's flank with a two-handed shove, just under the ribs, knocking the beast sideways into the bank. Old Scar twisted violently, his tail carving a trench in the wet sand. The giant stepped left, then dropped to a crouch, bare feet sliding in the slurry. Its fingers dipped into the mud, eyes locked on the gator's face. The gator's head reared back, jaws open. Then it lunged, not toward the giant, but toward the trap again, toward the young one. It didn't make it. The giant sprang, not a leap, but a driving lunge, and caught Old Scar by the snout. One hand wrapped around the upper jaw, the other pressed under the throat. The gator's eyes rolled, its tail whipped, but the grip held. The rain poured now. Sheets of it soaking fur, mud, reeds, all into one indistinguishable blur of earth and motion. And then the giant did something that didn't belong in a fight. It slowed, not weakened, restrained. Old Scar thrashed harder. One massive claw raked the giant's arm, blood mixed with water, dark and thin. The giant didn't roar, it didn't strike. It shifted its weight again, forced the gator's head sideways, and then it waited. Breathing hard, watching, holding. Old Scar's strength burned off fast. Whatever rage had brought it back was now tangled in exhaustion and pain. One eye, muddied and bloodshot, blinked slowly, clouded where the reeds had struck earlier. The gator pulled weakly against the hold, once, twice, then stilled. The giant loosened its grip, not completely, just enough to show the choice was its to make. The storm roared above them. Wind howled across the trees. But in that clearing, under the weight of eyes and silence, a decision was made. The giant let go. Old Scar collapsed sideways into the water, then heaved himself into the shallows. It didn't flee in panic. It backed away, watching, the way animals do when they've been bested and know it. Then, in slow motion, it turned, slid into the black water, and disappeared. Only the ripples remained. The giant stood still, chest heaving, arm bleeding. It turned, not to the humans hidden behind their branches and blinds, not to the world it had just defended itself from, but to the one inside the trap. The young one stared up, wide-eyed, unmoving. The giant stepped close, dropped to one knee, and exhaled. Its hand hovered near the smaller one's shoulder, then dropped, not in defeat, but as if to show peace. The young one whimpered once, a broken breath, and pressed its face to the giant's chest. There was no sound, but rain. The two shapes became one in silhouette, framed against the reeds and the silver-gray downpour. Martha stepped out from the tree line at last. Her feet moved, slow, deliberate. The honey jar was still lying beside the trap, tipped slightly but not broken. She bent down and righted it, leaving it there like a candle beside a prayer. Caleb emerged next, shoes soaked, mouth half open like a man waking from a dream. Daniel stayed crouched, camera forgotten, eyes wide and unfocused. Dr. Hargrove didn't come forward. He stayed in the shadows, arms crossed, watching not the giant, but the space between the giant and the young one. Watching for whatever was passed between them in the silence. Then came the motion no one expected. The giant stood and turned its back, not out of dismissal but trust. It stepped past the trap, past the humans, past the storm. Not a glance, not a growl. Just slow strides into the rising fog beyond the tree line. But not before it stopped near Martha. Close enough she could hear its breath. Close enough to see the blood on its arm. It looked at her then, eyes the color of wet soil, rimmed in light. And then it did something stranger than speech. It lifted its hand, open palm, not raised, not aggressive, just open. A mirror of hers. Years ago, when her son was sick and scared, she'd done the same gesture to calm him. Open hand. Nothing else. No words, no promises. Just that. The giant turned and was gone. The trap door creaked open behind them, untouched. The young one had moved, but not fled. It stood at the edge, staring into the place where the giant had vanished. Its legs still ached. Its eyes still searched. But it didn't run. It waited. Martha knelt beside it, close but not too close. She laid one hand on the earth between them. Not offering, not demanding. Just there. The young one didn't reach for it, but it didn't flinch either. Rain softened. Thunder faded into a dull rumble. And across the clearing, Caleb finally found breath enough to speak. Did it just let it go? Martha didn't answer. She touched the old scar on her wrist again, her fingers shaking now. Not from fear, but from recognition. Daniel sat down hard on the wet sand, the camera clunking beside him. Hargrove stepped out at last, finally moving, finally blinking like the spell had been lifted. "We just saw mercy," he said. But no one answered. The air was different now. Not safer, but sacred. The storm passed overhead, and the cypress swayed, and somewhere in the distance, the gator was still moving, but slower now, dragging the cost of its defeat behind it. And the footprints in the sand filled slowly with rain, but not before Martha saw one set turn back toward the trap. The small ones. The ones still leaning a little, but not as much as before. Not quite. The storm had passed, but left behind a hush so complete, it pressed against the skin like humidity. Nothing moved at first. The cypress leaves held their drip in long, slow falls. The sand steamed in silence. And the young one, mud-streaked, ribs still visible beneath the damp fur, stood alone now, outside the open trap. It hadn't fled when the giant disappeared into the trees. It hadn't followed. It just stood there, watching the empty space where its protector had vanished, eyes wide, chest rising and falling with small, careful breaths. Something in its posture had shifted. Not like before. The limp was still there, but it didn't lean as hard, didn't flinch as much. Just stood like it was waiting for the world to tell it what to do next. The grown-ups stood in a half circle, unsure if they should move closer. Martha was the first to approach. Not with urgency, not with pity, just with the same patience she'd use with a bee that had landed on her sleeve. She stepped forward and knelt in the mud, slow enough not to draw attention, and placed her hand gently on the ground again, palm down, fingers open, same as before. Not reaching for it, just being there. The young one turned toward her, head low. Its body trembled slightly, not from cold, but from everything else. It didn't make a sound. It didn't touch her hand, but it didn't run either. Behind them, Daniel whispered, "We should get it out of here, before the gator comes back." Caleb didn't answer. He watched the scene, watched Martha and the creature, like something was unfolding in real time he didn't want to interrupt. Dr. Hargrove moved closer, slow and deliberate, carrying a folded wool blanket in one hand and the metal box of his old tools in the other. His boots squelched in the soft earth. He glanced once at Martha, then back to the young one, and gave a single nod. Not to her, not to the others, but to himself. as if confirming something only he could feel. The air held still. The young one didn't fight when they carried it. It didn't struggle when the blanket was placed around its shoulders. When Dr. Hargrove gently touched its foot to examine the swelling, it flinched but didn't pull away. It let itself be lifted, slow, careful, into the back of the skiff, with 2 folded towels for padding beneath it. Martha sat beside it the entire way back. The oars barely touched the water. No one spoke. Even Daniel kept his thoughts to himself now. The air buzzed with a kind of reverence no one wanted to break. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had lowered behind the tree line, and the light had turned the color of old honey. Inside, the cabin was already prepared. A table cleared, a lantern lit. The beeswax candle in the corner still burned, untouched since the morning before. The smell of pine and old tobacco drifted in from the porch, mixing with the scent of wet fur and iodine. The young one was laid carefully on a mattress of dry straw layered with canvas and soft towels. Not a hospital bed, not a cage, just a space. Dr. Hargrove washed his hands in the metal basin, then turned to the others. "We'll need to drain the swelling. There's pressure building near the joint. Could go septic if we don't act fast." Caleb didn't hesitate. He moved to the opposite side of the bed and placed his hands near the creature's upper arm. Not touching, just letting it see he was there. "You sure we can do this without sedatives or something?" "We're not doing that," Martha said. Her voice was low, certain. "No needles, no pills, just steady hands." Daniel didn't argue. He stayed back, near the far wall, eyes fixed on the young one's face. Something in his expression had softened. Maybe it was the way the creature looked at them. Not like an animal, not like a pet, just a being in pain, unsure, but present. Dr. Hargrove dipped a needle in the flame, then into the iodine. He found the edge of the abscess, pressed gently. The creature growled low in its throat. Not loud, not angry, just a sound like someone clenching their jaw. Martha rested her hand beside it. Open palm. It stared at her fingers, then mirrored the gesture, lifting its own hand, palm up, letting it hover just above hers. Not touching, just mirroring. Caleb looked at it, then at her. Something passed between them, like recognition, not of species, but of the unspoken. Dr. Hargrove worked quick. The needle pierced, the skin gave, fluid drained, the cloth beneath darkened. He pressed gauze, wrapped, bandaged with the kind of care that spoke of years spent tending to wounded dogs, limping horses, things with names and things without. The room stayed quiet. When it was done, they let the creature sleep. It curled slightly, breath shallow but steady. The fur near its jaw glistened with dampness, rain or sweat or something else entirely. Caleb sat beside it, head down, eyes half-lidded. Daniel paced once, then stopped, then sat. Martha wiped the blood from the floor with slow, circular strokes. The lantern light flickered. Outside, the frogs had resumed their song, but it was a softer rhythm now, like a lullaby hummed after a long cry. Hours passed. When the creature stirred again, it didn't bolt upright. It lifted its head, scanned the room, and fixed its gaze on the fire. Then slowly, deliberately, it reached out its hand again, this time toward Martha. She didn't move. She let the space between them remain open. The fingers stopped just shy of hers, then fell gently back onto the blanket. Not trust, but something close. Something beginning. Caleb rubbed his eyes. "It's like it's watching everything we do, learning. Really learning." Dr. Hargrove didn't reply. He folded his blood-stained cloth and placed it in the wash bin. Then he looked out the window and said softly, "So are we." Later that night, when the creature slept again, the room full of slow breaths and wood crackling, Martha sat on the edge of the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of weak coffee. The rain had stopped, but the smell still lingered. Fresh earth, moss, lightning. She looked down at her wrist, where the scar ran pale beneath the skin. She touched it once, then let her hand fall to her knee. Behind her, Daniel stepped out quietly. He didn't speak. He just stood there. Then, after a long moment, he said, "I wanted to take a picture. During the fight. I almost did. I had the camera up. But then I didn't." Martha didn't answer. She stared at the trees. "I don't know why," he added. "I think I was afraid it would break something. Not the moment. Just something bigger." She sipped her coffee. Caleb joined them next. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed, hair still damp. "That thing's not a thing," he said. "It's family." Neither Martha nor Daniel responded. He looked out across the yard, toward the place where the storm had come and gone, where sand still bore the shape of struggle and survival, where silence had taught more than science ever had. Inside, the young one stirred. A faint sound, like breath caught on memory. Then stillness again, and just before dawn, before the sky turned gray and the birds began to argue about morning, it moved its hand again, palm up, resting in air, waiting for something. By late afternoon, the heat had softened into something quieter, the kind of hush that slips over the land after too much rain and not enough sun. The sky held a muted gold near the horizon, brushed thin with clouds that had nowhere else to go. The forest exhaled a slow breath, warm and still, and in that lull, the world felt suspended, like everything was waiting for someone to speak first. Inside the cabin, the air held the smell of soap and wet fur. The young one lay curled on the straw mat, leg bandaged clean and firm, but the skin around the joint had turned a deeper red. The fever had come sometime after midday, not burning hot, but enough to flush its cheeks and tighten its breath. Dr. Hargrove sat beside it, silent, one hand resting lightly on the young one's shoulder. Not pressing, not restraining, just present. He had checked the pulse twice already, by the neck and the wrist, counting slow, lips moving without sound. The rhythm was holding, but weaker now. Caleb stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes locked on the floor like he could bargain with it. Daniel leaned against the far wall, staring into the corner, the camera strapped limp at his side. None of them had spoken for almost 15 minutes. Martha stepped in carrying a folded wool blanket and a small tin box. She set them down gently on the table, then walked over to the window and opened it just a crack. The breeze carried in the faintest trace of honeysuckle and pine resin. She inhaled once, slow, then turned to face the room. "I'm going to ask you all for something," she said, voice low but steady. "I want your quiet. I want your stillness, and I want your permission." Caleb blinked up at her. "For what?" She didn't answer right away. She walked to the hearth and knelt beside a canvas bag. From inside it, she pulled a square of folded wool, deep blue, rough, the kind of fabric that had been hand-knitted, not store-bought. It had worn patches where the thread had been rubbed raw, and a single corner was mended in red yarn. Caleb recognized it before she spoke. So did Daniel. "My son's," Martha said. "I made it for him when he was 16. He took it to basic, never asked for anything else. When the letter came, it came back with his things. I couldn't bear to wash it, couldn't fold it neither. I just kept it in a drawer." She stood, wool still in her hands, walked over to the mat, and knelt beside the young one. Its eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. It didn't move. She set the wool down beside its chest, just where its hands could reach it if they chose. Then she unscrewed the lid on a small glass jar of honey and placed it on the floor in front of the blanket, the scent warm and sweet in the quiet room. Her hands moved slow, deliberate, every motion careful not to disturb the space around her. "I'm not asking it to come," she whispered. "I'm asking it to know we're ready." Daniel's voice cracked in the quiet. "You really think it's out there still? It never left," she said. "It's watching, But it won't come to a threat. Won't come to fear. It'll come to something honest. Dr. Hargrove nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and so they waited. Martha stepped outside alone as the sun began to slip into the treetops. The yard was damp, the soil soft underfoot. She knelt by the edge of the porch and laid the piece of wool on the grass, folded into a neat square, the jar of honey set gently beside it. Then she sat back on her heels and opened her palm, facing upward, bare, quiet. She didn't look around, didn't scan the woods, just kept her eyes on her hand. The breeze picked up, rustled the leaves. A bird called once, then fell silent. She held still. The light faded slow. Then came the shift. Not a footstep, not a sound, just a pressure in the air, like gravity remembering itself. The leaves held their breath. Somewhere near the old pine, something moved, slow, weighty, close. The scent of rain returned, sharp and earthy. Martha didn't raise her head. She kept her eyes on the wool, on the honey, on the open hand resting gently on her thigh. The figure came forward, massive, silent, not charging, not stalking, arriving, one long stride at a time. The light caught its fur, matted in places, damp in others, streaked with debris from the forest floor. Its breath moved heavy in the evening hush. And then it stopped just before the blanket. One hand lowered. It didn't touch the honey, didn't sniff the wool. It just stood there, looking. Then it stepped forward, one pace, then another. Then something in its posture shifted. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The spine loosened. And finally, its hand, broad, thick, lined with scars, reached out toward the wool. Not to take it, not to claim it, just to feel it. Fingers brushed the fabric lightly, barely enough to move it. It turned its palm downward, pressed it once over the red-stitched corner, and held there. Martha exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Behind her, in the cabin, the young one stirred. Not with fear, with recognition, as if the scent of that touch had reached through the air itself. Dr. Hargrove opened the door, slow and silent, and stepped aside. The giant didn't look at him. It stepped forward, careful, each step tested before placed, like it was walking across memory itself. Inside the room, the young one raised its head, and the moment the elder stepped through the threshold, the creature made no sound, but reached its hand out and placed it gently on the wool as if answering a question. Dr. Hargrove moved aside. No words were spoken. The elder knelt beside the younger, inspected its face, then its leg, breathing deep like it was taking in everything: pain, scent, history. It touched the bandage lightly, then sat back, resting its weight on its haunches, arms draped loosely over its knees. Its eyes scanned the room, not accusing, not grateful, just aware. Caleb didn't move. Daniel stood frozen. Martha stepped inside last, and the elder looked at her. It did not nod. It did not bow. But its breath slowed, shoulders relaxed. Then it turned back to the young one and touched its brow with the back of its hand, soft and short. The gesture lasted less than a second, but it was everything. Outside, the wind changed again, from the northwest, carrying a cooler note through the trees. The air no longer held the scent of blood or panic, only earth and wool and honey and something old and forgiving. When the elder stood, it didn't look back. It stepped aside, clearing the path from the bed to the door. Then it waited, and the young one understood. It pulled itself up, slow, tender, still limping, but less now. It leaned on no one. It paused only once, at the jar of honey on the floor. Its eyes landed on it, then moved on, and as it passed the threshold, it turned its head once toward Martha, and for the first time, she saw it blink, not in fear, in knowing. Then it followed the elder into the dusk, and the trees swallowed them both, and the scent of wool and honey stayed behind, like the last line of a story whispered to the dark. The nights were getting longer again, not cold, just stretched, like the land was trying to remember what quiet really meant. The stars came slower now, behind layers of cloud that barely moved, and the moon was a pale smudge above the cypress line. It had been 3 days since the young one left, but its shape still lived in every corner of the cabin. The straw mat on the floor still held the bend of its weight. The blanket smelled like damp fur and pine, and somewhere in the far wall, near the window with the broken latch, was a small smudge of dried sap where it had leaned one hand while standing. Caleb stood beside the hearth, holding a clean cotton bandage in his hand, even though no one needed it. He looked at the supplies laid out on the table. Iodine, tweezers, salve. All neat, all ready. But the room felt lopsided now, like a story had paused halfway through a sentence. Outside, the insects had started their rhythms again. The deep thrum of frogs, the high tremble of cicadas, the creak of branches shifting with slow wind. Daniel hadn't said much since the day they left. He cleaned the skiff, reorganized his gear, but the camera stayed in its case, not because he didn't want to use it, because something inside him now felt different about what could be captured and what shouldn't be. He sat on the back steps now, staring at the trees, the light from the lantern behind him casting a long shadow across the yard. He held a tin cup in one hand, steam rising in soft spirals, and let his mind go quiet. Martha sat at the table with the same quiet grace she always carried, except this time her hands were folded, not working, just resting. She watched Caleb, but not directly, just enough to know he hadn't moved in a while. "Still hurting?" she asked softly. He shook his head, but the gesture was uncertain. "I just thought we'd have more time. Thought maybe we could do more." "You did more than enough," she said. He didn't reply. From the front of the cabin came a soft shuffle. Not outside, inside. The sound of something shifting straw. Not loud, not fast. Caleb turned, heart suddenly racing. But it was just the sound settling. Nothing more. Still, it made the memory breathe again. Dr. Hargrove was the last to speak that day. He'd taken to sleeping near the wall, a folded blanket beneath his spine, boots always beside him. He was older than the others, but he moved like someone who knew the limits of his body and worked within them like a craftsman. He stood now, walked to the table, and dipped a cloth in warm water. He wrung it out and laid it across his palm, then carried it to the mat and bent down, smoothing it across the same place where the creature's chest had once rested. "It's not about how long you keep something," he said. "It's about how deep it leaves its mark." Martha nodded. "I think we've been changed," Daniel said from the porch, almost to himself. "Not just in how we see them, but in how we see us." No one answered. The room held the weight of something sacred, like a church without pews. The air inside still smelled like soap and wildflower and earth. Caleb finally moved, setting the bandage down, stepping out into the yard. He looked toward the tree line, not searching, just hoping. Martha followed him a moment later, draping a shawl over her shoulders. "What if they don't come back?" he asked. "They never really left," she said. He nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Behind them, the lantern flickered. Dr. Hargrove placed the medical kit back in its drawer. Daniel lit another oil lamp without being asked. And in that strange rhythm, like a family that had weathered something unnameable, the night stretched long and soft. But then, just before the air could fall back into stillness, there came a sound. Not a knock, not a cry, a brush. The soft, unmistakable brush of fingers against wood. Caleb turned first, eyes wide, breath caught. Martha lifted her head. Daniel stood too quickly and bumped the doorframe. Dr. Hargrove paused, hands still on the drawer. The sound came again. This time on the side of the cabin, near the edge of the porch. A scrape. Then 3 slow breaths. Not human, but not animal either. Caleb took a step forward. Martha raised a hand, not to stop him, but to steady him. Then, in the golden haze of the lantern, the figure emerged. The young one stood just beyond the porch light, fur darker now with age or rain or both. The bandage was gone, the limp mostly faded, but its eyes held the same ache, not pain. Something deeper, recognition, and it wasn't alone. From the shadows behind, two smaller shapes waited. Not siblings, not mirror images, just others. Shapes of the same kind. Watching. Still, but not afraid. The young one stepped forward, one hand raised, palm open, fingers slightly curled, and Martha stepped down from the porch. She didn't speak. She didn't offer food or honey or thread. She just opened her own hand in return. The distance between them melted slowly, and when the young one reached forward and touched her fingers, just once, lightly, it wasn't asking for help. It was giving something back. Daniel exhaled loudly. Caleb swallowed hard. Dr. Hargrove rested both palms on the table, watching with the quiet awe of a man who had finally seen what he always hoped might be true. Then the young one turned, walked to the edge of the yard, looked back once, and the other two stepped out from the trees. All three looked not at the humans, but at the cabin, at the porch, at the space, as if marking it in memory. And when they vanished into the brush, nothing chased them, because nothing had to. Inside, on the floor where the straw mat had rested, the shape was still there, only now beside it, something new. Not a footprint, not a claw mark, but a small smudge of honey on the wood, and a thread of wool, red-stitched, left neatly near the door. By dawn, the fog lay thick over the reeds, moving in long, slow drifts across the water like it had nowhere else to go. The trees stood half-drowned in mist, their trunks fading in and out with the wind's breath. Everything was quiet, not silent, just watchful, the way the swamp always was when it had just been given something back. At the edge of the clearing where the cypress knees reached like fingers from the water, Martha stood with her shawl pulled tight and her boots sunk halfway into the damp earth. The morning light hadn't quite broken yet, just that soft gray hour when the world hadn't fully decided to wake. Her breath showed faint in the air. Summer was slipping away. Caleb stood a few feet back, arms folded, eyes on the trail. He hadn't spoken since they left the cabin. His thoughts moved behind his face like wind behind a curtain, brushing past but not seen. Daniel knelt closer to the edge, one knee deep in mud, pressing a fresh square of plaster into a footprint half hidden under a layer of new dew. It was small, still wider than a man's, still deep in the toe pads, but the gait was straighter now. No drag, no lean. The limp was gone. 2 feet beside it, larger, firmer, marked the path. And both sets walked side by side now. Parallel, no more following, no more staggering. Daniel leaned back and let out a breath. They're walking together. Caleb nodded. That means they're okay. No one said what else it meant. That they'd gone. That it was done. That whatever thread had bound them here had been quietly, gently tied off in the dark. Martha stepped forward, eyes on the prints. She didn't crouch, didn't press her hand to the ground. She just looked. The fog shifted around her, wrapping her shawl and skirts in soft silver. She turned her head toward the trees. "I thought I'd feel sad," she said. "But I don't. Not the kind I expected." Dr. Hargrove spoke from behind them, his voice low but firm. "That's not sadness, that's reverence." They looked at him. He was holding a pad of paper in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other, slowly sketching the curve of the footprints, the shadow of movement across mud and moss. He'd drawn like this his whole life. Birds, broken dogs, antlers half shed in January. But this was the first time he'd drawn something that felt like it was watching him while he drew, even from beyond the tree line. Daniel set the mold gently on the wood plank they'd carried out. "We'll let it set here. Ground soft enough to hold it steady." Martha knelt and brushed her fingers over a spot just to the side of the prints, where the reeds had been bent inward, forming a path just wide enough for something with shoulders as broad as a barn door. "They knew this land," she said. Knew how to move without breaking it. Better than we ever did, Daniel muttered. Caleb stayed quiet, his eyes moving to the horizon. The first blush of orange had started to bloom behind the fog. Not full sun, just the promise of it. They turned back together, walked slow. But when they reached the cabin, Martha stopped short. Something had changed. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, just different. On the front porch, right along the edge of the boards near where the bees liked to drift in the late afternoon, someone, or something, had placed a line of reeds. Not a circle, not a symbol, just a single line. Straight, clean, as long as an outstretched arm. Each stalk pressed gently into the wood. Aligned, deliberate. Martha crouched beside it, ran her hand above it without touching. This wasn't here when we left. Daniel stepped closer. What does it mean? Caleb looked down the path, where the fog was already fading. I don't think it's a message. Not the kind we'd write. I think it's a direction. Hargrove nodded slowly. Go forward. Martha stood. The shawl slipped from one shoulder, but she didn't fix it. Or keep going, keep living. None of them said more. They didn't have to. The rest of the day passed quietly. They cleaned the cabin. Not in a rush. Just with the kind of care you give something after a guest has stayed. The mat was rolled and shaken. The water basin scrubbed clean. The corner where the young one had once rested was left empty, but not barren. Caleb placed a single folded towel there. Not for show, just as a gesture. Daniel opened his notebook for the first time in days. His handwriting was slow, his lines deliberate. He didn't write facts or measurements, just memories, descriptions. The shape of the breath in the room, the curve of a hand near another. Dr. Hargrove sat outside, sketching the final strokes of the footprints while the light stretched long across the yard. Martha made tea, and as the sun began to dip once more behind the tall pine, a breeze moved through the yard and knocked over nothing. That night the crickets sang louder. The frogs joined late, and inside the cabin the lantern flickered without protest. Martha sat by the window with her journal open, pen poised but still. Then after a long pause, she wrote, There are some wounds that never truly heal, but compassion knows how to walk each other home. She set the pen down, closed the book, and listened to the bees hum against the screen. And for the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone. Sometimes the world doesn't ask us to understand. It just asks us to stay long enough to witness. There are stories that don't arrive with answers. They come quietly, dressed in silence, carried by wind, by water, by a pair of eyes that hold more history than words ever could. Some truths don't need explaining. They need space. Space to be felt, to be remembered, to be honored. And sometimes what matters most isn't what we find, but how we choose to meet it, with fear or with reverence, with noise or with stillness, with force or with compassion. Because the deepest connections are rarely forged in moments of certainty. They're born in hesitation, in the gentle pause before a touch, the offering of a hand without demand, the trust that blooms slowly in the quiet breath between strangers. There are wounds in this world that go unseen, not because they are small, but because they are old, passed down, buried in earth, in silence, in ritual. But compassion doesn't need to heal all things to matter. Sometimes it simply walks beside pain, listens to it, gives it a place to rest. This wasn't a story of dominance or of conquest. It wasn't a tale of man versus mystery. It was something older, something humbler, a reminder that not every question must be answered to be understood, that not every being we meet is ours to define, and that not every goodbye is the end. There is a kind of language that doesn't need speech. You find it in the stillness of a clearing after a storm, in the weight of a footprint side by side with another, in the silence that says, I see you, I won't harm you. Go on. So if you've made it this far, thank you for listening with your heart. for walking through the fog, for being the kind of person who chooses to feel even when it's easier not to. Maybe you've carried something with you through this story. A question, a memory, a name. Maybe it reminded you of something you thought you'd forgotten. Or someone. Whatever it stirred in you, we're honored you shared this moment with us. If this story moved you in any way, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us what stayed with you. And if you'd like to be part of more stories like this, ones that honor the quiet, the sacred, the strange, consider subscribing and following along. There's more to come. Always more. Until then, wherever you are, may you walk gently, and may you always be met with open hands.